Hello and welcome to today's A-Team Group webinar covering market data management, licensing and administration in the post-COVID environment. My name's Sarah Underwood. I'm an editor at A-Team Group and I'll moderate today's webinar. Our expert speakers today are Julia Guerasimova, Head of Market Data and Administration at Man Group, Rob Merrick, Senior Consultant at CJC, Evert-Jan Brundel, Managing Director, Customer Delivery Services at TRG Screen, and Suzanne Locke, Chief Executive at EOSE. I'll ask them to introduce themselves in a moment, but first just a little bit of house information so that you can make the best of today's webinar. To the right of the video screen, you should see a panel which says polls and questions. We'll be running 3 audience polls in today's webinar, so please do take part. Very interesting to hear your views on our questions. In the question panel, please ask any questions you would like to our speakers. We'll take them as we go along, otherwise we'll lose them all at the end. So place your questions there and I will put as many as I can to the appropriate speakers and hopefully we'll be able to help you with some answers. Okay, that's it for me at the moment. So Julie, please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your role in market data administration.
So I'm Julie. I head up the Market Data Administration Department in Man Group. I look after all things market data from reporting to commercials around market data.
Lovely, thank you. Rob.
Hi there, I'm Rob Merrick. I'm one of the senior consultants at CJC. I focus mostly on market data strategy and compliance with our clients.
Thank you. Coming to you, EJ.
Hi, EJ Brundel, TRG Screen, where I am responsible for the delivery of our services, including managed service, professional services. Right before that, I was actually running the consultancy group, market data consultancy group at Screen.
Thank you. And Suzanne.
Thank you, Sarah. I work for EOSE and we work on behalf of data producers as well as data consumers. I think for this panel, I'm a data producer, looking at the challenges of selling data out to clients or delivering data to clients.
Okay, thank you all very much indeed. And let's get on with our discussion. But first, let's run a poll question. And it asks, how complex were the administrative challenges of market data management caused by COVID-19 at your organization? So give that some thought and please place your votes while I come to Suzanne to set the scene and describe the administrative challenges COVID-19 caused for market data managers and how these challenges were resolved during the pandemic.
Thank you. So from our side, for our clients who are producing data, the challenges, of course, were to get the business activities running so that the data was uninterrupted going out the door. So, trying to make sure that if they're running a brokerage or a trading venue, none of those connections and all of those feeds carried on as usual as everyone migrated to home working and back again in some cases. And then for the market data teams themselves, getting in touch with the users and responding to those user requests where the use case changed and they already have a contract with the client to use the data in a particular site, and suddenly that site is now 400 sites where everyone's working from home and they're looking for remote access. So responding to those requests and understanding those use cases and finding flexibility within the contracts to mean there's no risk for the user that they're suddenly outside of the scope of their agreement.
Okay, thank you. EJ, what would you add there? What did you sort of experience over the last year or so?
Yeah, it's very similar to what Suzanne was saying. Of course, we saw also that our clients were kind of scrambling to get organized, working from home. Sometimes that did involve getting additional licenses, but also to get, private stuff kitted out and sort of make it connect to the company network and all of those things. In addition, of course, to changing working days and all of that. That was, of course, one of the major challenges. And also, as Susanna says, after a few months, of course, people started to realize that the topic of licensing was starting to evolve because, what to do with the concept of location when you have all of a sudden dozens, if not more, of sort of additional locations that you have to deal with. But we could also see that vendor organizations were very cooperative, so that the initial effort was left, for people to sort out, and then of course later on that became more of a topic.
And I think later on might be now. We were talking before this. It felt very business as usual, actually, quite quickly. The market responded. I was astonished how quickly people migrated to the new normal. And it felt like business as usual. And the very temporary solutions were now unraveling. And I think we're now looking at the challenges. So I wasn't looking at the challenges this time last year. I think we were all focused on getting everyone up and running and maintaining the flow, and now everyone's sort of unpicking what the world might look like now and how we deal with everyone being at home was okay. Everyone being in the office and at home is more challenging because you have to try and service both of those use cases at the same time, and not, it's still only one user, so they still only need one access, but we've got to try and recognize that that might be different in the office than it is in the home environment.
Sure, we'll come back to you, look into that and how you can best manage that kind of situation. So as you're saying, a sort of tactical, now moving on to a more strategic approach to sorting it all out and making it presumably rather more future-proof. Exactly. Okay, let's see those first poll results, if we may. EJ, there are the poll results. How did the people find it during the pandemic?
Yeah.
Would you agree with that? Yeah.
Yeah, I guess it's clearly somewhat more complex compared to the usual situation, which is consistent, I guess, to what we just discussed. A little complex compared to usual, and not very many people thought that it was no more complex than usual, which of course also makes sense. I can totally relate to this result. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much indeed. And moving on and bringing you in here, Rob, with some staff going back to the office and others continuing to work from home, how can market data managers adapt their approach to maintaining control of market data, vendor relationships and licensing?
I think market data managers, they're going to have to take a measured approach depending on what their new team setup looks like, what the company has implemented, and how they've been impacted and what they've learned over the last year throughout sort of the COVID pandemic. Some people will have thrived from working from home. They haven't spent the time traveling. They're more relaxed, and actually you've got more out of them. They've been more productive. Other people might not have had the correct facilities, be perched on the end of their bed working from home, and maybe have found it a lot more difficult and are really desperate to get back into the office. So unfortunately, it's not sort of a one-size-fits-all approach, and there will be some trial and error. And I think you've got to listen to your staff. You've got to take into account what you've learned over the last year. You might have to tweak the tasks and responsibilities that you sign, what you sign to who in your team off the back of all of this. With regards to maintaining control of market data, I think the processes will largely remain the same as before. I think the bigger impact will be on vendor relationships and licensing. Flexibility that Sarah and Co mentioned before, that was granted by vendors during the pandemic, but that they will start to remove that in the coming months. And I hope vendors take a pragmatic approach to that, but it's definitely, we need to see where the dust settles on that. The vendors will have to adapt their licensing to cater for the new normal, i.e., again, as Sarah mentioned, contracts that specify specific offices or locations at the moment will have to be opened up, as not all people will be in the offices. The other key part for me is vendor relationships. I think that's the more difficult one that's going to have to be overcome, because having a face-to-face conversation across a desk or across a meeting room table is very different to that of having sort of a video conference, and you can read people's body characteristics and body language and things like that, and you won't have that. Even the conversations walking from collecting the reception to up to the meeting room, a lot happens in that time, and you won't have that. So you've got to come up with other ways to build vendor relationships, I think. Yeah.
Okay, we'll come back to that and third-party relationships in a little bit. But Suzanne, to add to that, what would you say in terms of sort of getting it all under control when people are in different places?
I think it's enormously challenging. I was surprised, actually, thinking about this ahead of this call or this webinar. I thought it really was business as usual, but it's not. We're so used to people, the vendors walking the floor, doing training. For my clients to get their data in front of the end user, you need to have someone who can sit in front of them and show them how to find it, show them where the best FX data is or where the best commodity data is. And having a trainer or a vendor representative walking the floor, or your market data teams helping the end user to find the data they need, understanding what's within their license requirements. You know, you can use this content, you can't use that content, or you can use this, but you can't extract it. That's all a very face-to-face, activity. And I think I'd underestimated for sure the difference it would make when the end user is just working remotely. They're trying to find the data for themselves. They're trying to find it within their desktop or within their systems and processes. And it's much harder when you can't just call over to the guy on the desk who has that vendor network or have your vendor walk the floor. So it's challenging for us to get it in front of the end users as someone who's producing data and wants to get it out there. It's then difficult for us to understand what their new requirements might be. You know, it's been a year already, so the requirements have changed from when they would have last been approached or spoken to, and their team may not have had the opportunity to, go around and see what they're doing with it, see what they want to do with it, see where their roadmap is and what they want to do with data and what other data has become available in the year. So I think finding ways to do that is going to be interesting. Getting on calls with teams, getting to the application owner, getting to the vendors, maybe it opens the door for smaller niche vendors to be able to get in, because that physical presence of some of the top tier vendors coming in and walking the floor and kind of owning that dealing room, I think we'll see less of that if everyone's remote, and they might look for a cheaper, more nimble solution that they can roll out on their desktops at home. So I think in a year we'll be looking at something very different.
Okay, meantime, I have a question I'm going to put to EJ and to you, Julie, if I may. And it asks, let me come to you first, EJ. It asks, were vendors concerned that firms had users in sites that they weren't licensed for, or was this sort of just something you had to pass by? You've got your mute on, EJ. Thank you.
I think in the initial months, people were not so concerned, vendors were not so concerned. I guess everyone was willing to help the end user firms out to make sure that they could continue business as usual. But of course, then I think we kind of touched upon it already. People started to realize, well, this is a different landscape now, quite literally. How are we going to get our arms around it? And of course, that's where you sort of, need to make sure that you keep track of everything that is changing, and that you can build a record of what has become the new reality, what has become the new landscape. And that is, of course, certainly in this new world where we seem to have a hybrid of working from home and going into the office, it's even more important now.
Julie, did you have experiences like that where vendors were concerned that your people were not where they usually were, and that they may be in places where they didn't have a license for obvious reasons, particularly at the beginning, I guess, of the pandemic?
I think across the board, most vendors adapted very quickly to working from home, so we didn't particularly encounter any issues with that. Similarly to what Susan had mentioned, most of the vendors reacted very quickly and very efficiently to the new normal as it is for the time being.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Thanks for that. Hope that answers your question, whoever asked it. Thank you a lot very much. So yeah, let's run another poll question. This time, to what extent has your organization had to increase budget and human resources to manage market data in the new working environment? Now, on this one, you can select as many of the options as you like. So while you do that, let me come to EJ to ask him to what extent he thinks a mixed working environment requires extra budget and resource.
Yeah, again, there's the difference there, I guess, between the first 3 to 6 months and what happened afterwards. I guess in the first 3 to 6 months, everyone was scrambling to get new kit out and to make sure that everyone was actually able to work from home, because not everyone had a laptop from work. And if they did, that was perhaps not kitted out in the way that it should be. So there was a lot of work to be done there. Of course, people had to make sure that everyone got equipped with the right stuff. And in addition to that, you had people struggling with broadband and making sure that all of that was sorted out. Now, whether that means that on the longer term there will be more budget and resources, that is hard to say, because you also see that some offices are getting smaller, right? So it kind of depends on where you draw the line in terms of what is part of the budget and what is not. You know, if you take a narrow look at market data, budget and resources, you know, that longer term, I don't think there will be a difference. You will have the same discussions with both end users and with vendors about usage, about you know, what business purposes you are using the content for. Ultimately, that should not depend on working from home or not. So again, apart from the initial scramble, longer term, I don't think there should be a need. I mean, I'm actually curious to see what the poll says. I wouldn't be surprised if market data managers said, well, I actually need a lot more money now. Boss, are you seeing this? But we'll see that.
Okay.
So I suppose.
Okay, Rob, I'll leave you to conjecture on that before the poll results come out as well.
I mean, I broadly agree with EJ on that. I think there may be a period over the next 6 months where there's a short-term requirement for increased budget, where some of the sort of flexibility that has been provided by vendors starts getting taken away, and you might need to subscribe to a few additional licenses until either you get a chance to renegotiate contracts based on new use cases, and the dust sort of starts to settle in that part. You know, I really don't think any vendor should be taking advantage of the pandemic to try and increase profit or anything like that, but it just may be a sort of short-term temporary knock-on effect where over the next 6 months costs increase slightly while everyone sees, you know, what the new normal is, and rearrange their licensing agreements to take that into account.
Okay, so let's have the big reveal, please, and the poll results. There you go. Well spoken, both of you. So no expectations of increases in resources, then no increases in budget, some a little bit. Yeah, and nobody really having significant increases there. Thank you very much indeed. And Rob, may I come back to you with an audience question? And it asks very much around this space. I've lost it. No, I haven't. It asks essentially, we review all, of course, our licenses, contracts and everything all the time, or not all the time, but in regular intervals. Is there something particular we should be looking for at this time?
I think really, I mean, you know, the banks, the bank to bank, it's the location strategy. That's the key part for me, I think, is any contracts where they are specific around locations, departments, teams, or anything like that may have changed in that period, and also you know, some vendors where they, you know, have contractually allowed sharing of terminals or sharing of resources when it's, you know, you can walk up to the terminal or something like that. Obviously, lots of people working from home, not naming names, but I know they've allowed remote connections in the short term. That's going to be phased out shortly. So you need to look into, you know, what's the short-term cost impact if these 5 people who've been sharing a terminal historically now have to have their own license, or are there any alternatives in the short term, or other services such as, like Suzanne mentioned, that allow them to access the data that they need without maybe a tier 1 vendor cost associated.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And coming back to you, actually staying with you, Rob, now, what are the pitfalls and risks of not addressing the new working environment? I know that's highly unlikely in an extreme case that, you know, people will be addressing it to some extent, but what happens if you don't, you know, detail it as much as you would as if you were in the office, perhaps?
I'm an optimist. I think that the new working environment provides opportunity, and I think if you embrace that and you adapt correctly, it can be really beneficial for you. On a staffing and resourcing level, as I mentioned before, you know, there are some people who much preferred working at home and were much more productive because, you know, they weren't spending 3 or 4 hours a day commuting, and their sort of work-life balance was better, so the quality of their output was better. If you take those people and force them to go straight back into the office without sort of taking into account, the benefits that you've received, you might have a negative outcome there, and you might lose some productivity, but you also might end up losing those key staff members to other firms that are offering that flexibility. With regards to licensing and vendor relations, I think you need to make sure that you understand the impact that the COVID pandemic has had on your business and the way that you work and the way that you function, and then you need to take all of those thoughts into your vendor negotiations. You definitely don't want to be any worse off from a financial, contractual, or anything sort of point of view. So you need to make sure that all of the impacts that you've experienced are taken into account in your next round of vendor negotiations, and that you also keep the key vendor relationships as well. When, as Suzanne mentioned, you're not seeing them every day walking around the trading floor and things like that. That might create a bit of a vacuum, and I think time's the only way that you're going to find out the best way to address that.
Okay, EJ, do you see risks there? Obviously, a lot has been ironed out now, but what are the problems that still exist here?
I see more. I agree with what Rob was saying. In addition, more towards licenses and all that. I think the big pitfall or challenge, if you will, is to keep track of everything, right? I think we said it before that you want to maintain visibility and transparency of what services are out there, given by whom, keep track of things so that nothing falls between the cracks. That is an important aspect, especially from a contract compliance point of view. You don't want to feel as a market data manager that you're exposed because of the things that you don't know, right? So you want to always keep track of what you have installed out there with users.
Okay, thank you. We have another user question, sorry, audience question. Let me put this one to you, Suzanne. We've talked a lot about how vendors helped through the early phases, getting everybody up and running and so on. How can they help now, the market data vendors, to allow firms to make best use of third-party data in the new normal? Are you expecting help, or is it very much back to, no, not no help, but get on with it?
How will the vendors help the end users to use third-party data? They all have different approaches, so to make a statement across all of them would probably be problematic because they all have such different approaches. Right. I think it's fairly well known that some vendors take a revenue share, so they're incentivized to get the third-party data in front of the users. And then depending on their structure, that will be by end user or by non-display use. So they'll be pushing their preferred approach. So I can't see that changing. I can't see them taking a dramatically different approach to third-party content. There's definitely a move to looking at the value add for each third-party content they carry. So as a data producer, getting it onto the platforms and getting that focus from the vendors on your data and getting it in front of the end users is more challenging because they don't have the resources to carry data that isn't offering any benefit to them or their end users. So there has to be an end user use case for them to really take on third-party data. So how we find that use case when everyone's working remotely, and as I said, if you can't get to the end user is going to be challenging. But I think the vendors, where they see value in the data, they're committed to it. Where they see end user requirement, I think they will work very hard to make sure the end users can use it and can use it in the way they want to, that supports their workflow. And we see a lot of work happening anyway, regardless of the pandemic, in new and innovative ways to get data to end users so that they can use it in their working environments, into sandboxes, into cloud, into analytics, into machine learning. Just the end user on a terminal is such a small piece of it that I think we'll be supported by the vendors in much the same way we have been.
Okay, lovely. And while we've stopped for some audience questions, can I come to Europe? This one, what is the panel's outlook on market data regulatory reviews, and what should be the wish list to the regulators in this space?
That's a difficult one. So, I mean, what was that to do with the pandemic? Put me on the spot, that one. Can you read the question again there? Sorry.
Yeah, sure. What is the panel's outlook on market data regulatory reviews, and what should be the wish list to the regulators in this space? I think you can answer that one quite broadly, not necessarily just re the pandemic.
Pragmatic. I'm a big believer, I think with everything, everyone wants to be compliant, everyone wants to stick to regulations, whether they're from the exchange, whether they're from the regulator, but they've also got to understand, the amount of work that goes in behind the scenes and companies to require them to meet all regulations or meet all of their licensing requirements, and they've got to be pragmatic about what they request from the end users. I would say on that, they can't be asking in this difficult sort of day and age for massive resource intensive requirements or licensing or anything like that, I would say.
Okay. Anybody else like to comment on regulatory review of market data? Yeah, Suzanne.
Yeah, I would just say from a data producer, particularly in exchange, you've got fair and reasonable requirements around your pricing, and you're trying to be, as an exchange, you're always trying to offer fair and reasonable whilst commercializing the use of your data when it is used with commercial value. So, the regulations are driving the exchanges to be fair and to have reasonable pricing. And then we try to have that. There's always a discussion around standardization of contracts and the benefits of having standardized contracts, which would have lent heavily on having a standardized definition of a user or of a location. And I think those standard terms are largely now more complex and more difficult because of the pandemic and what's a user now. All the standard definitions we had of a user that fit into the regulatory environment are no longer really what they used to be, because a user isn't one person, one login. It would be one login at home and then a different terminal in the office, or one location. Is that where the end user is contracted? Is it where the end user server sits? Is it where the end users, if you're remoting onto a system, is it where your remote terminal is? Is that your location? So, suddenly all these site definitions and location definitions, which fit into the regulatory requirement to be fair and reasonable and to have standard equal terms across all users, it's now becoming problematic to shine a light into that.
Okay, fine. So something to think about for sure. Absolutely. Thank you. And staying with you, Suzanne, can you talk us through a little bit about how firms can adapt their market data administration processes to the new normal, and as well in the light of ever increasing information subscriptions and complex contracts and invoices? Perhaps you could talk us through a sort of case study to explain how that might work.
Yeah, exactly. And I wish I had the answer, so I'm going to talk about it as well as I can. We're working with clients now who, as I say, we're looking at standardized contracts, and if I'm developing a price structure and packaging for a client, ordinarily you would look at end user, you would look at location, you would look at the use case. And we try to allow those use cases to be as flexible as possible. But, as we were just talking about, if you have a site that could be 400 people in an office in a city, or it could be 4 guys working in a tiny office in a more remote location, that's got even more difficult now under the pandemic. So I think in terms of adapting your admin processes is to work more closely about understanding the use case, really speaking to the end user or the end user's market. So speaking to Julie and understanding exactly what her users want and where they are and what challenges she has, and making sure that she doesn't have any liability, because nobody wants to be hit with a big audit. No one wants to find out they're in breach of contract through the changes. So, I think in terms of adapting your process is to try to, with a narrative, write in whatever, you might need to write a new addendum or a schedule to your contract just to sort of patch over the part now until the final solution is reached, because you may have 2 years to run on your contract, and you're going to put in place temporary processes. So let's have a conversation. Let's put in place a schedule or an addendum so that you're covered and you're not at any risk of any liability.
Okay. EJ, what would you say here in terms of data administration processes?
Yeah, in addition to what Suzanne was saying, I mean, we can see two topics with our clients that actually were already there before the COVID period, but have probably become more topical now. And that's two things. It's the ongoing discussion about the product catalog, and the second is rights management. Okay, we see that at TRG Screen all the time. Product catalog is basically this holy grail of, you know, having one database where all the products out there are captured and where you can look up, you know, the alternatives to Bloomberg and the alternatives to MSCI, and that you can see line by line what it is that they offer, and would that be a real substitute. That is probably even more important now, because people are wanting to have more choice and wanting to see what they can do with the data that they have now from a vendor, and that is not always very visible. And I might even go as far as saying that some vendors keep it sufficiently vague when it comes to you know, what the rights are, and that is of course the link to that other topic that I mentioned, rights management. You know, that it's hard for a market data manager and anyone in market data management to keep track of what is it actually that an end user is allowed to use, you know, when they want to issue a product, for instance, on the back of a benchmark index, or they want to sort of start, you know, doing portfolio management or risk management using the data from a certain provider. Are they allowed to do so? That question has always been there, but it's becoming even more topical now, because, you know, you can walk down the aisle and ask people in market data management quickly, you know, how is this? No, you have to sort of increasingly rely on you know, databases or systems where that information can be found. Not saying that it's all out there to be found, but it's one of those things that will probably be even more important in this new normal.
Okay, thank you. So some greater work to be done there, and let me bring you in again, Julie, to look at sort of rather almost the other side of things, which we've talked a lot about, but from the other way. How can market data managers prevent breaches of vendor licenses, and how can they organize market data use, cost and access in the new working environment?
So one of the key things that we found is looking after your inventory and making sure that your inventory is 100% accurate to what the actual use of your data is really, really important. Doing spot checks on your inventory is something that will allow you to assess whether you are in breach of any of the contracts. So in essence, performing a mini internal audit and reviewing, I've reported this, my actual usage is something else, why are there issues and where these issues lie. It allows you to address any issues that you may have in terms of your compliance, in terms of your licensing, prior to them becoming an actual problem before you have any fines. The other thing that it allows you to do is to double check that all the usage that you do have internally is being actually used. So you have users for your data licenses. It's not that it was a license which was acquired 5, 6, 10 years ago and it hasn't been reviewed since. And there are still users who utilize the data in the manner which the license covers you for. The other side of things as well, which I think is really important, is that you spend a lot of time with the people who look after your administration on the day-to-day, and you develop their knowledge around market data. Market data licensing has got far more complicated over the last 5 years. Even 5 years ago, non-display would have covered you for everything, which is now categorized most probably into 2 to 3 different categories. And the people who manage your inventory, the people who do the active enablements on a day-to-day basis, have to have the knowledge to know that if I switch on for application A, will I or will I not be in breach of the contract? So developing the knowledge around the contracts and the commercials within the teams who actually do the permissioning is really, really important. And it allows for them to make sure that you have that additional layer of checking before any license, before you get to the point that you could breach your license.
Okay, thank you. Rob, what would you add there? What do you see people doing to make sure they don't breach licenses? And, you know, obviously we've talked about the many, many different facets of mixed work from home, work in the office. How do you see that happening?
For me, I think transparency is the key. You know, building a lot on what Julie said. You know, if you can, you know, when you sign a contract, you need to understand the contract. You need to try and pull out the key areas. You know, if there's user number limits, build that into your inventory system so you can't physically go beyond that. If there's location limits, again, or, you know, locations that the services can be used at, you know, you don't want to be allowing yourself to add a service that's outside of that. You know, some of the inventory platforms allow you to build in those checks and balances. You need to pull out, you know, the non-display, you know, what is derived. Pull out the key areas of the contract and make them available either in inventory platform or in another tool that people can easily access. So there's no benefit to having a contract that tells you what you can do if you just put it in a drawer somewhere or if you file it away somewhere. You need as many people as possible having simple and quick, easy access to that data, because if you make it easier and you front up this information, it's much easier to stay compliant when you're permissioning users or when you're allowing different use cases or when you get asked questions.
Okay, thank you both on that one. And to our audience, if you have any more questions for us, because I think we will have a little bit of time as we go along. But coming to our final poll question, this one: to what extent has your organization optimized market data across the new working environment? I suspect we'll get pretty mixed results. And while you vote on that question, let me come to EJ, please, to talk a little bit about technologies, tools and services that can help here. Obviously, we've talked quite a lot about licensing rights and that sort of thing, but what sort of technologies, tools and services can help people get this right?
Yeah, well, thanks for asking me that question. What we are seeing in TSG Screen obviously is that, you know, once the inventory of market data sources and applications is up to date and also reliably being reported on, you know, the attention typically moves to usage, right? And that's an aspect that is much harder to track. You know, you can, for contracts, establish who is allowed to do what with the data. But once you have installed people with a service, say, you know, we have a contract that says that you can have 100 people access that data set. Of course, it would be very interesting to know, are people actually using it, right? And that is not so easy to track, certainly in a COVID type of environment, working from home, where you can actually not always, you know, walk up to the training room or to the others, you know, in portfolio management, whatever, and then have a look. So that means that you need to deploy some tooling to keep track of usage, and it doesn't even have to be very complicated. Sometimes it's already good to know whether people log in at all. You know, have they logged into a certain service in the last month? And if you find that some people don't log in at all, that's of course very, very useful to know, because it will help you when the contract comes up for renewal, and you may have some scope for reduction in scope. But, you know, there are also toolings that go much further than that, where you can actually see what sections of web portals are used more frequently than others, and that may sort of help you determine whether some areas of a vendor's offering is more valuable to your end users than others, right? So you can take that very far. But what we're seeing with our clients is that it's especially useful to know who's actually accessing a service in the first place, and those findings can be quite shocking, in that, you know, you find yourself having you know, got an enterprise-wide agreement for a certain service, and only a handful of people are using it. But then, of course, the real challenge comes, and that is to go back to the vendor and to negotiate it down. That is the hard part.
Okay.
I see Bob nodding, but he probably has been there and done it himself.
Excellent, I'm sure she has. Rob, what would you say there in terms of useful tech tool services?
I mean, obviously, automation is the key for all of this. You know, resources are scarce, and any resources spent doing sort of non-value add work should be minimised. So I'm a big believer in all of that. I mean, what we've seen with our clients recently are sort of three main areas where they've been contacting us. You know, sometimes they want us to do contract reviews, and as I mentioned in the previous answer, you know, they're looking for external help to just call out the key areas for the key contracts or the key services, so that they can front up and make available as much information to help with compliance as possible. The other part is companies are now putting a lot more focus on understanding how they use the data. Why does that application exist? What is the use case behind that application? Why is it using that data set? Because then if you've got that sort of information, you can make better decisions when you're going into negotiating with vendors. So we've done a lot of work with clients, going around interviewing, helping them get an understanding of their data and their use cases in that, because sometimes maybe you haven't got enough resources around that. And then the other key part to this is data standardization or things like that. If you want to automate, you need to have good quality data, and a lot of this data might be 5-10 years old. If someone has put services that were added 10 years ago were added in one way, and descriptions were put in one way, and then services that have been added by different people 5 years ago or 2 years ago have been added in a different way. And if you try and automate off the back of that, and your data isn't standardized and your data isn't quality, it's very difficult to automate off of that. So again, that's another service that we've been getting phone calls about, is can we go in and help almost create a data tidy up, a data cleanse, so that people have got the building blocks to then automate on top of. And I see that growing in the coming months and years.
Okay, fine. Thank you very much indeed for that. And let's see the poll results, if we may now, about optimization. That looks excellent. What would you say to that, Rob? Looks pretty good to me.
It's been the driving force. People have been trying to optimize. That's why our industry exists, is to try and get as much data, as many services for as optimal value, or as good a value as possible. So you would hope that this is the sort of poll that comes in, so it shows that we're all employed for a reason. Doing a good job.
Excellent. Okay, that's great. And coming back to you, Julie, if I may, and looking at cloud technology, what is the appetite here for moving market data into the cloud, and what are the challenges and opportunities of this?
I think over the past few years, the development of market data in the cloud has been on the up. You've seen vendors moving their data into the cloud. For a lot of market data users, when you're looking at the sort of main items when you're managing your market data, managing your market data infrastructure will fall within that. And cloud-based solutions allow for you to have a pay-as-you-go model, which for a lot of companies, especially for smaller companies, will be a massive benefit. There are no large infrastructure costs which you have to pay up front. The pay-as-you-go model doesn't limit you to a specific bandwidth for a lot of the market data infrastructure that you buy. So instead of having to buy big 10, 40, 25 gigabyte lines, you can use as much as you need without having to pay for more than you're actually utilizing on the day-to-day. For a lot of companies as well, as more market data suppliers move into the cloud, we do have a quicker time to market. So in essence, as soon as you, as an organization, are able to have all your market data licensing commercials in place, you are able to get the data from the source to your company very quickly. There's no reliance on your technical teams to install infrastructure, go to data centers, complete networking and patching, when a lot of the sort of hard day-to-day IT is managed by the cloud providers. The issues around cloud, I think, and one of the biggest challenges is latency, and that will remain for quite a while, I think. With latency, for people who are partaking in high-frequency trading, low-latency trading, algo trading, the latency element will always play a part, and it is a challenge which the market data cloud providers still have to overcome. And from that perspective, I think if there is a way to overcome it, then a lot of the market data vendors will end up looking for cloud solutions and moving into that space quite quickly. But for the time being, as it stands, I think it is very important for people who do manage their market data to know exactly how that data is being utilized, because in the short term, a lot of non-latency sensitive items can potentially move to cloud-based solutions rather than staying on the sort of bulky infrastructure that we have for a lot of market data feeds now across the board. One of the other sort of big challenges outside of latency is as great as it is that we are able to save costs, pay-as-you-go solutions in regards to budgeting are not ideal. It's hard to budget as you go from an operational expense, which is your monthly standard flat fee, to a variable cost, and predicting your cost for the year is always going to be a challenge for market data managers.
Okay, Suzanne, what would you add there in terms of moving to the cloud?
I was just laughing because it's pretty hellish to try and work out how to charge for it as well, Julia. So we're struggling with the same problem on the other side of the table. I mean, I think Julia and I spoke about this before. There are kind of two parts to this question. One is the new user, the new use case, the entirely new functions that you can do in the cloud that you weren't doing on your old infrastructure, which is the real, the frontiers of the kind of market data world, where people are doing exciting new things with exciting new data sets, commingling things, running analytics, doing all the really kind of new things. And then there is, I think maybe what Julia was speaking to as well, the migrating existing services and offering the same service but through the cloud delivery rather than on the old. And I think those two things maybe have two different types of challenges and different opportunities. The challenges for the new world, I think, are less. I think the opportunities there for everybody, because it's exciting new use cases, it's new world, and we're all adapting quite nicely to it, I think, and finding our feet. Migrating traditional systems or existing use cases into the cloud is a completely different challenge. As Julie said, you can't budget. It's difficult for me to charge you on a pay-as-you-go. And still keep it fair and reasonable, still make sure that everyone's paying the same, making sure that we're still within regulation. On behalf of our clients, we need to make sure that they know where their data is being used. And on the cloud, I think there's maybe a perception that you lose some controls and some sort of visibility of where the data is going. So if I need to know, if I'm providing you with a piece of data, and I need to know if it goes into an index, if it goes into an ETF, if it's used in a tradable instrument, I need to know that as a data producer. So am I more at risk when it goes in the cloud that data is being used in a way that it's not intended for, or that puts me at a risk regulatory, that I'm now contributing to something that the data isn't intended for? So I think for my clients, the concern around cloud for existing use is partly that, to be completely frank, I think there are users with established businesses that worry that they're going to eat their own lunch. They're going to have to pay. They're going to have to offer a smaller package, a very detailed pay-as-you-go per instrument almost fee, and they have big existing packages through the vendors, and the users are going to migrate to this cloud technology and start to pick up just the data sets they really, really need and use them a handful of times, use them end of day, use them at close of business, use them at specific moments in time, and pay a very granular fee for that. And it's gonna be interesting. And I think I'm going to go into the next question, so I apologize, but Julia, we got really excited when Julia and I were talking about it. It gives us a really great opportunity to reinvent the world. We're going into a whole new greenfield. We can reinvent this. We can undo all the mistakes that we've made through all the legacy systems where we're working on. So if you go through a vendor, you've got a pricing code, you've got a packaging code, I've got a permission code, I've probably got some sort of instrument code. They're all different. None of them relate to each other. We're not entirely sure that what I've commissioned is what I'm seeing on my invoice. It's really difficult. And I know that the two guys are nodding because they deal with that web all the time, and half of their existence is trying to help the user overlay that. And we have the same problem. So in this new world, we can undo all of that. I can give you a code that's specific to this instrument, and you can permission the instrument and you can pay for the instrument, and it will be the same code throughout the system. So I think that because I'm a geek, got very excited about all of that. And it's a challenge, but it's a great one.
Okay, Julie, what would you say there in terms of, sort of the benefits you can get out of taking a proactive approach, presumably to the data, the vendors, everything?
Yeah, I completely agree with Susan. I think a lot of cloud providers offer solutions as well. So it's not just that you're managing the licenses from your perspective. In terms of the tech, you can essentially add tags, which means that for market data managers, it allows for you to have a more granular view of exactly what teams, what departments, what areas are utilizing the data. So it's not just that it's a very high level, this service relates to this supplier and this license. It's also that we know that this team internally is utilizing the data. And from a market data manager's perspective, it's ideal because you can see end to end where the data originates and where the data ends. And for anyone who does manage market data, it's perfect. You don't have to worry that there's a non-compliant user sitting in a different area who shouldn't have access to the data. All of your data is controlled. You have full view of the license and you have full view of every department who has access, which is great.
Okay, great new feature then. And I have one more, maybe, yes. I have one more audience question. I would like to put this one to you, Rob and EJ. And we've talked about cloud, we've talked about tooling, we've talked about services and solutions and that sort of thing. And it asks, is the role for machine learning or AI here, perhaps not now, but to learn the processes and the trends of around market data? Rob, do you want to go first here?
Yes, I think so. Slowly, bit by bit, it's definitely going to be coming in. I'm a big supporter of this. I think the thing that holds back at the moment, and with lots of this stuff, is the quality of the underlying data and the new world that Julie and Suzanne speaks about. That's definitely, if we can get rid of the bad habits of the past with the inconsistent naming conventions, inconsistent way of managing data between vendors, etc. If we can get rid of that, then I think it's going to be sort of an exponential curve towards what can be delivered and how quickly things can be delivered in that world. But I think it's very difficult to apply that to the current state of market data, but hopefully the current state of market data is not going to be around too much longer, and onwards and upwards.
Okay, EJ, what would you say there, sort of moving on with the technology?
So we at TRG Screen actually do deploy machine learning software for our invoice processing as part of our managed service. Right, so we have quite a few clients who have asked us to process their market data invoices for them, and we can do that indeed much faster and scalable than many clients can by deploying software that actually interprets the invoices of the vendors, the most common vendors for sure, in a fashion that we can actually process them quicker and faster than most clients can, and we do plan to do more in that area, because as the others on the panel will acknowledge, the invoices of vendors are not getting any easier these days. They can be quite complicated, they can be quite lengthy, they can be sometimes seemingly contradictory to the contract. So there's a lot of interpretation that has to be done, and lots of understanding that has to be applied, and that's why it's no longer a pure administrative task. It's actually a lot about interpretation, and machine learning can aid in the process by doing all of that and still have a very quick turnaround.
Thank you. I didn't put this one to you, Julie, but to ask you as a user, is that something you see coming forward?
Yeah, I think across the board it will have a much bigger impact.
Okay, great. Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. And finally, wrapping up everything we've covered during the webinar, let me ask our speakers to give you some advice, things that you may be able to take away and actually implement quite quickly to help you as you readjust to working from home, working in the office, and all that entails. So may I come to you, EJ, first, and would you kick off with some advice for our market data managers adapting to the new normal?
Yeah, probably most people have figured out how they should do their job in an optimal way. But from a personal experience, when I was still running, or doing consultancy projects, it's very important to stay close to the business, right? And to stay close to the users, to know what they're doing, what their requirements are, what their issues are, so that that you understand them as a market data manager, but also that they know that you can help them, right? And that's the reverse, the flip side of the coin there is that you also need to be transparent to your users in terms of what you're doing or what you're considering in terms of potentially looking at alternative services. Would they be good for you, the end user? Before COVID, it was arguably easier to do because you would just walk up to some people on the floor, and that's of course not so easy anymore. So make sure as a market data manager that you know what's going on, and the reverse, that they know what you are doing.
Okay, excellent. What advice would you give, Rob?
So for me, I think the three key things, you've got to be understanding this is new to everybody. Relationships are going to change, but they're not going to change the same way for everybody. The way that you deal with people has got to change, and you just got to accept that it's going to be different. I think you've got to see this as an opportunity and embrace the change, really. Sort of, I always find some of the more positive changes that I've ever made when I've been a market data manager or as a consultant have been in the midst of large changes or anything like that. So this is an opportunity, and if you embrace it and you drive it, take control of it, then you can come out the other side in a really positive place. To reiterate that, I think continue to focus on driving the benefit for the business. If you continue to do a good job, you'll continue to have the respect of the business, which makes everything easier.
Excellent. And Suzanne, what would you say? I think opportunity is not far from your lips.
I think it's communication is the key. You've got to have a narrative with both the user and the provider of data, and then you can find there's always a compromise. There's always, everyone's prepared to be understanding, I think. So, well, not everyone, some people less so, but generally there's opportunity to compromise and to find a solution that works for the use case that you have right now and the use case that you think you're going to have tomorrow. And it's never perfect. You're never going to have something that's perfect. You just need to I think if you know the limits you're operating within, then you know where your outer boundaries are.
Okay, and finally coming to you, Julie, as a practitioner, what advice would you give your colleagues?
I agree with what was said earlier around maintaining the supplier relationships. Your vendors, as much as you would like you to be compliant with your data usage. Don't be afraid to ask the questions around, if I'm using the data in this way, what licenses do I need? Don't be afraid to ask around any existing license usage. Managing your inventory is the other big item I'd say that we should all, as market data managers, be concerned with. The more you know about what licenses you have, the more you know around what usage is covered, and where your exposures are and where your risks are. And the last bit of advice I would say is be proactive. Have a look at what's available on the markets. If a cloud-based solution is something that would work for your organization, I would say investigate it, have a look, have a conversation with some cloud providers and some vendors, and actually see the practical implementations.
Excellent. Thank you. And thank you to all our speakers for sharing their expertise and experience. Thank you too to CJC and TRG Screen for sponsoring today's webinar. It's been a good conversation. Before we close up, just a quick note that if you scroll down your screen to additional options, you can see some A-Team resources that may be of interest. You can register for our July 2021 Trading Tech Summit Global Virtual, which of course will talk a fair bit about market data. You can watch a recent A-Team group webinar on approaches to migrating market data to the cloud to drive agility in trading operations. And you can sign up for next month's RegTech Summit Virtual. Some exciting news here at A-Team Group is that we're planning to launch an ESG channel called ESG Insight very soon, a channel dedicated to all that's new and developing in the ESG space. So if that's of interest to you, you'll be hearing about that very soon. That said, that's it for today. So thank you again to Julie, Rob, EJ and Suzanne. And thank you to all of you who have watched the webinar. Please complete our feedback form as we're always keen to hear your views and improve our products.